Good morning, everybody. This is going to be video 2 of our 5-part video series. In this video, we are going to be creating a simple Spring Boot server that can respond to both a GET and a POST call. So let's jump right into it. So we're going to open up our terminal. All right, we are going to go ahead and make us a directory to put this code in. So we're going to say make directory demo2 tutorial video, and then we're going to come over here to our IDE. Going to go File, Open. We are going to go to our repositories. We're going to grab demo2, and we're going to open it up. Alright, now we're in full screen mode. Alright, so first things first, right click, new module. We're going to call this demo2. Our group is going to be coffee code creatine.education, and then our artifact is demo2 jdk14. We're going to roll Java 11 today. We're going to use a jar, and we're going to use Maven. So we're going to hit next, Spring Boot 2.7.0, and create. And now we have our nice little project. So in the first tutorial we deleted this help ND. We're just going to close it. We're not worried about it. And so we should have a very similar structure. We're going to have our demo2 application, which just runs our main method. But to get started, we need to create our first REST controller. So same thing as we did last go round. Package controller. And then inside of our controller directory, we are going to go demo2 controller. All right, now inside of our demo2 controller, we are going to do a handful of things, but the first thing we need to do is annotate this whole class with REST controller. Now, at this point, REST controller is red. IDEA is not offering us any help other than add Spring Boot starter web to class path. The reason this is showing up is because in that first video, we actually put Spring Boot web in our POM first, and in this one, we have yet to do so. So let's go ahead and do that. We need to add in a dependency, and then our group ID for Spring Boot web is going to be org.springframework.boot, I believe. And then inside of our artifact, we are going to have Spring Boot starter web. And we don't need this version because we're going to pull it from our actual version of Spring Boot. So we are going to use that little button that comes up is the same as pressing this guy. We are going to refresh our Maven dependencies. All right, we come back over here to our controller, and our REST controller is underlined, meaning we can now import. All right. So what we are going to do in this video is we are going to create a GET as well as a POST. So last go round we had a Git Mapping, and this basically just returned a hello. But in this tutorial we are going to want to have a GET return something, and I think it would be pretty cool if the POST actually created the something. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a Git Mapping, and we're going to call this something like super rudimentary, just like get item, right? And so eventually what we're going to have, and this is the take home of this lesson, is how to write a get and a post. So all of the wrapper or helper code is going to be non-best practice, and we'll call that out as we write it. And then in demo 4, whenever we actually start using databases, we'll make things look a little better. But what we're going to do is this Git mapping is going to return something out of a just in-memory hash map, and then the post is actually going to put something in it. So to get started, let's go ahead and let's use a list rather than a hash map. That'll be a little more exciting. So let's make a list of something. I'm not quite sure just yet. We're going to call this pretend database, and this is just going to be a new array list. All right, let's grab some of these, and let's make this just like a list of pretend database objects. We'll make our own class. Pretend database object. All right, and so this is red because that class doesn't exist, so we'll have to go ahead and write that up. Pretend database object, cool stuff. So for the time being, let's go ahead and create our data structures that will allow our mappings to work. So we are going to need a public static class. We will call this pretend database object. Nope. Object. And what are we going to have in here? Let's say we have a string, which we'll call key, and then a string, which we will call value. And I think that's realistically all we're going to need. We should make a constructor. So public pretend database object. We will pass in a string key and a string value. And we'll go this dot key equals key, and then this dot value equals value. All right. And then I guess we could go ahead and create an empty constructor. Excuse me, sorry. Which will do nothing, and then we'll probably want to have like some getters and setters. And so we'll go ahead and import list real quick. Could we write out our getters and setters ourselves? Sure, but that would take a lot of time, which is far less fun. So here we're just going to go generate getter setter, highlight both of our values, hit OK, and now we have getters and setters for our little class. So helper code is now squared away, so we can get back to the post and get. So let's go ahead and work on our post first so that we can actually create the information and then we can fetch it. So much like we have Git mapping, we have post mapping. And we're just going to call post mapping something super creative like add item. And then from there, this add item is going to return the object that it adds. So we are going to say pretend database object, add item, and then we are going to annotate this with request body. And then we are going to say pretend database object, pretend database object. So this is realistically just a method, right? We're returning our pretend database, add item is our name. This request body annotation gives us a little bit of magic. So what this is going to do is this is telling Spring the payload that we are getting sent in, right, the request body, we want to parse that into a pretend database object, and we're going to name it pretend database object. Right, this way, what we can do is take that object, manipulate it however we see fit, and then add it into our list of things. So for example, let's say we wanted to pull our key out. We can go string key, pretend database object, get key, right? All of our helper methods that are associated with that object, we can invoke just as you would expect. So then we can go string value, pretend database object, get value, same sort of deal. And then if we felt so inclined, we could print this out just to sort of see what's going on. So print line, we'll say this is, all right, so we'll say object passed in has key of key and value of value. All right. Now, remember when I said we were going to call out non-ideal practices as we went? So first things first, storing data in a global list isn't really a good idea. They should be a database. This class realistically shouldn't be a static class inside of our REST controller. It should be external. And then lastly, this system.out.println, we're doing two things that are kind of ugly. One, we're actually just like printing to the terminal as opposed to using a dedicated logger. And two, we are appending strings together. This should be a string builder. This isn't the purpose of the tutorial, but I figured I would at least call it out. So once we have our data that we are printing, we are going to add it to our quote pretend database, which is really just a list. So we're going to go pretend database.add pretend database object, and then we are just going to return the pretend database object. Now Spring Boot is going to give us a lot of help. This return is going to take this object and serialize it for us. So this will return something that actually looks like JSON. All right, so let's go ahead and test that out and see how it performs. So we're going to go ahead and run our demo2 application. Right, our application should spin up, and then we can go to Postman, and we will go localhost colon 8080 add item is what we called it. Right, this is going to be a post. We need to have a body. It's just going to be raw JSON, and then for our payload, we needed a key and a value. Key. We're going to call this test key, and we're going to say value, value test value. All right, then we'll send. And so we get our response back. We get a status of 200, which is great. And then inside of our server, we go object pass in has key of test key and value of test value. So everything's working pretty good. And if I had printed out this list, we would see it there, which we can do that a little later. But so far, so good. Everything's working as we'd suspect. So we'll go ahead and stop our server. And let's go ahead and work on that Git mapping. So we will create a Git mapping, and we will call this something creative like get item. And so whenever we have a get item or any type of get, we need to have some type of identifier to fetch the object itself. In the event you're using something like a database, this could be a primary key, or it could be a name that you could do a search on. In this scenario, we are going to use a ID, which is realistically just going to be that key that we used. So the way we can do this is go get item slash open curly brace, close curly brace, and put an ID in here. What this is going to allow us to do is for our method, whenever we go pretend database get item, we can use an annotation called path variable, right? And then call this a string of an ID. And what this is going to do is it's going to say this quote ID here that is wrapped in curly braces, we call this a path variable, and that path variable gets stored inside of ID, right? So then what we're going to do is we're just going to iterate through that list that we are keeping in memory, looking for that ID. Whenever we find it, we'll pull it out of the list and return that. So we'll just use a real simple loop to do this. So for int I is less than our pretend database dot size I plus plus, right? And then we'll say if pretend database dot get I dot get key equals our ID, right? Meaning that we actually found the object. We will return pretend database dot get I. So in this case, what we could do is print out that we actually found the thing, right? So we found an entry using ID, right? So then we will return the actual object, and much like we do for the post mapping, Spring Boot will render that nicely for us. Or I shouldn't say render, serialize. We'll serialize it to JSON. And then once we get outside of our for loop, in the event we actually do, that means we failed to find the thing. So we will say we failed to find an entry using ID. And I I guess we can just return a new pretend database object with nothing in it. And that should go ahead and take care of that. All right, so let's go ahead and give this a run. Why is this highlighted? We're not going to worry about an enhanced for loop today. All right, so demo 2 application. We will start this up. That will boot up as we expect, and then we will open up Postman here. We'll go ahead and add an item with test value and test key. Right, so that was added. And then we can go localhost : 8080 / get item / and then here we use test key as our value. We go test key, we hit send, we get our nice little payload back, and then over here it says we found an entry using ID test key as we want. Now, if we changed this to something like potato, right, send that through, we get an empty object back with a we failed to find the entry using ID potato. So everything is working as we suspect. All right, and so that is how you implement a simple post with a request body and then a simple get with a path variable. Pretty straightforward. We used a list to just hold data. In demo 4, we'll actually get into using databases, which will be a bit more best practice. But for the time being, here's your simple gets and posts. Thank you.